Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this Network Mind Out webinar. My name is Sally Morris. I'm the coordinator of the Mind Out project here at the National LGBTI Health Alliance. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're gathering today, and to pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to pay our respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. As is also practice at the National LGBTI Health Alliance, we also like to pay our respect to our LGBTI elders who have many paved the way for the work that we're here doing today. For today's webinar is all about building intersex peer support. And I'm really excited to have Cody Smith here today, who is currently working at Agenda in Canberra. Within an LGBT organisation, but providing as an intersex project position, and really is one of its kind in Australia, and really is quite interesting to be exploring the role of building intersex support services within an LGBT context. So I'm going to hand over to Cody. Before we start, Cody will be taking some questions for today's presentation, which they'll be doing at the end of today's presentation. But I would just like to encourage people, there is a chat box, and this is how you're going to be able to communicate with Cody and myself. So if you have any questions for Cody that prompt throughout today's webinar, please type your question in the chat box. But we won't be answering them throughout the webinar, but we will visit those at the end. And there'll be quite a few times for some conversation. Also, if there's any technical issues that anyone is having, please just type a message in the chat box and I will see that and hopefully be able to support people in their participation. Today's webinar is also being recorded. And a recording will be made available on the National LGBTI Health Alliance's website for sharing hopefully next week. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cody, who's going to be talking about building intersex peer support. Thanks, Cody.
Thanks, Sally. So just before we get started, the graphics you see through here are little graphics that I do to advertise all of our various intersex peer support groups. They prove to be quite popular, but just so you know what the deal is going on with there. A good place to start off is always with a little bit of Intersex 101, but hopefully people who are here are a bit progressed now, so I'm going to try and skip through as quickly as possible. Intersex people are 1.7% of the population that are born with variations in sex characteristics. They're one of the most misunderstood demographics under the LGBTIQ acronym. And as a population, they face quite different challenges compared to a lot of other groups underneath that acronym. So one of the big issues is with medical violence, this idea of coerced medical intervention that can be inflicted on minors without consent to correct sort of these variations in sex characteristics. But if you want sort of like to deep dive on what intersex issues are, the Darlington Statement is a very good resource. It was produced by a large group of intersex people coming together and figuring out what we sort of need from our communities. So that gets straight into why do intersex support? And you do intersex support because intersex people need support. When we talk about the issues that intersex people face, we talk a lot about trauma. Trauma sort of manifests as experiences with the medical community that are negative. It sort of manifests as things that were done in childhood that might not be resolved. And so the sort of key reason for an intersex person to reach out for intersex support is to try and work through some of that trauma with other intersex people. A lot of intersex people talk about shame and isolation. They have a lot of troubles with their family who might have made decisions for them that they later regret, or made decisions that they're told not to talk about. And as a result, a lot of intersex people who approach support spaces need to be able to need to be able to connect to other intersex people to know that they're not alone, but also to try and challenge notions of body shame and challenge notions of sort of difference. And of course, one of the big things about peer support is that it helps produce better medical outcomes. When you tap into the knowledge of a community, you suddenly realize what you need to ask for, how you need to ask for it. You get to find out about resources in your broader community, and it's those sorts of conversations that produce better medical outcomes for intersex people. Another really, really important factor to all of this is that people who have intersex people in their lives need support. A big part of, or what I feel to be one of the most vital aspects of my work here, is the story that my mum would always tell, that when I was born, they took me away and there was no support, there was no information. They were just thrown in the deep end, and like suddenly everyone's trying to tell them to make choices that they weren't equipped for. So I think it's very, very important that no matter when someone finds out that they're intersex, no matter sort of like under what circumstances, the people in an intersex person's life also need support, because it's such a complex and scary thing to deal with if you don't have information to deal with it. So when we talk about providing support to sort of intersex adjacent people, we sort of, the outcomes that we want for that is to stop medical intervention on minors, so to create alternatives for parents, and ultimately to promote acceptance and understanding of the circumstances which can help reduce family strain. And tying back into that sort of first point, allows us to combat shame and isolation. Another reason to do intersex support is drastically underfunded. And this is an issue that has just come up again and again and again. And I think it's one of the reasons why my work here at AGA is particularly exciting. It's because I have all the resources I need to consistently provide an intersex autonomous support group, and one for parents and families and partners and all those intersex adjacent people. The reality that we deal with is that there's a lot of LGBTQ organisations that receive government funding to tackle intersex issues, but then only assume the intersex issues in the context of the broader community issues. So we see marriage equality represented as an intersex issue, or we see birth certificate reform presented as an intersex issue. But actually, what we need is sort of human rights frameworks that protect our rights to bodily autonomy and help create safer spaces in medical settings and access to peer support. And there's very much a reality that intersex-led organisations struggle to find resources. So when Sally points out that my position is quite unique, as far as I know, I'm one of the only paid intersex positions in all of Australia, with the only notable exception being ERA, Intersex Human Rights Australia. They get some international funding that allows them to pay to part-time workers, but the idea that there's only 3 people in Australia being paid to do this kind of work should be alarming to people, especially when you think about how many resources exist for trans and gender diverse people, and how many resources exist for LGBT people. So there's a lot of good reasons to establish intersex support, but I've been doing this for a year and a bit now, and I've come up against a lot of interesting challenges. One of the big things about the intersex community is it contains a lot of its own sort of diversity. A majority of intersex people do identify with a binary sex that's assigned at birth. The majority of intersex people are straight. And as a result, its relationship with broader LGBTIQ community is rather complicated, but also those interactions play out as lateral violence inside the intersex community itself. So one really, really good example of an ongoing debate inside sort of intersex circles is this sort of talk about terminology. We have this idea that hermaphrodite is this archaic and cruel slur that was used for a very, very long time as a term of diagnosis. So there is an older generation of intersex people out there who only ever had the term hermaphrodite to describe themselves. So we need to figure out how to bring those people into the space. Intersex is sort of the preferred term for a lot of people. It's a term that people are more or less comfortable with, but there is a strong association with being the I in LGBTIQ, and we'll get into why that's a bit of an issue later, but there's a split down the community as to who's comfortable being associated with that LGBTIQ and who's not. The term that's sort of replaced intersex is disorders of sexual development. That's a term of medical violence that would make a lot of intersex identified people feel unsafe to approach intersex groups and intersex support. But there's definitely an emerging term, VSC, variations in sex characteristics, which is more or less becoming the preferred terminology. It's seen as neutral, it's not seen as loaded language, and I do think that we're going to start seeing a shift to that particular terminology. But the point is, when you have a population that can describe itself with 4 different words, you have to be able to set up a space where all of those terms are valid while recognizing how each of those terms might be contentious in the space. It's also been my experience that a lot of intersex people don't know they're intersex. I would say that most initial contact with a gender agenda on intersex issues is a narrative of, I have these surgical scars I cannot explain. When I tried to talk to my parents about this, they told me to drop the issue. I tried getting access to medical records and was denied, and I think I might be intersex. So bearing in mind that that's sort of like how people sort of approach the space, you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of sort of support we provide are looking into sort of diagnostic options, trying to find intersex-friendly doctors who can help support finding out more information about that kind of thing, because a lot of people feel very, very insecure in these spaces when they don't necessarily have a diagnosis, or when they don't necessarily have language to describe what they've been through. It's also really, really important to note that intersex needs are very, very different to the rest of the trans and gender diverse community. So a gender agenda is a trans and gender diverse and intersex organization. It's been that way since its establishment. And for a long time, the assumption was that by creating space for TGD and I, you would get TGD and I. My role was created ultimately to try and bring more intersex people into the community. But what's become very, very obvious to me is that when I attend a trans and gender diverse support group, the needs, the conversations, the ideas that are being shared in that space are very radically and fundamentally different from the conversations that are happening in intersex spaces. So intersex spaces need to be more body positive. People need to be reassured that whatever differences they're dealing with, that it's okay, it's part of natural human diversity. Where obviously transgender spaces carry a lot of body shame, sort of processing dysphoria. There's a sort of like a need for intersex support to be trauma informed. Conversations around doctors and surgery and all that sort of triggering content needs to be handled with a higher degree of sensitivity, where obviously a lot of transgender people approach their spaces to find out like find out more information about transition, about like options for hormones, options for surgery, which doctors are trans-friendly. So that can be something that can put intersex people off trans spaces. There's also a lot of challenges in referrals because you can't guarantee that a trans-friendly doctor is necessarily going to be an intersex-friendly doctor. They might have just one set of processes that is inappropriate when it comes to dealing with gender reinforcement for an intersex person. So, yeah, these are some of the sort of challenges I faced when trying to set up intersex peer support here. Now, the big sort of, well, I suppose tapier in the room is that intersex people have gained a little bit of notoriety for being quite hostile towards LGBTQ organizations. And to me, this has been the most substantial challenge in my work, is that there's a lot of intersex people who don't identify as queer, as rainbow, as LGBTIQ. And while you can argue that's sort of misplaced internalized homophobia or transphobia, the reality is if someone has that hang up, they're not going to approach your space. There's also a lot of challenges when it comes to navigating intersex gatekeeping. I've had a lot of experience, and I know that a lot of other intersex people have had experiences where being a non-binary person trying to engage with an intersex space, that can generate a lot of hostility because there's an assumption that non-binary identities are supposed to undermine intersex identities. So I think it's important to be mindful of that sort of gatekeeping. Another thing is sort of like diagnosis versus not having a diagnosis. There's a lot of intersex people who feel like the only way you can be authentically intersex in a space is by having a diagnosis, which obviously can make a space hostile to those who aren't sure, who haven't got the full story, who don't have all the details, but still need support. And I think there is a bit of a perception that with some intersex support services, it's seen more as support for activists. I think there's a bit of a challenge when approaching some of the more established intersex support groups that these structures exist more for people who are willing to engage in education, in pride, in being open and seen. And I think that can be very confronting and challenging for intersex people who don't want that, who just want to be small, who just want to be supported in the space and not be intersex when they walk out the door the next day. So what works? We talked a lot about the challenges, and ultimately I have come across things that I feel have helped build intersex community here. Meaningful allyship, or rather, let's jump back a step. Conscious visibility is a term I use for it's not good enough to just throw some yellow and purple up and then expect that intersex people will feel comfortable in the space. It has to be done understanding why those symbols exist. It has to be done with an understanding of what those symbols mean, and it has to be done with deliberate allyship, meaningful allyship. This idea that if you're not actually trying to do things for intersex people, that intersex people aren't going to take you seriously. So meaningful allyship, a really simple way to sort of like immerse yourself in this idea of meaningful allyship is to engage with the Darlington Statement. If you read through the Darlington Statement, if you and sort of like internalize what those mean, like what it all means, if you start enacting policies in your workplace that embrace the Darlington Statement, those can be ideas of meaningful allyship that show an intent to do right by the intersex community, and that will help people get in the door. Pride symbols are also a very, very important thing. When you walk into AGA, one of the first things you see is our calendar of intersex events. You see a portrait of an intersex activist. You go into the back room, and I've got my flag above my desk and a copy of the Darlington Statement on my desk. There's brochures everywhere. The point is that someone who walks in here isn't just being overwhelmed by rainbows and trans flags and just thinking to themselves, there's no place for me here. We've created the place for them here. It has to be done consciously, it has to be done with a sense of allyship. But if you don't bother at all, you're not going to get people to come in the door. Yeah, so that gets people in the door, and then you need to demonstrate values as well. A couple of the resources I set up for AGA to help show that we're as intersex competent as can be is that I actually separated the AGA's brand from Intersex at AGA. So it's this idea that AGA operates, but intersex services are separate, so that you don't have to feel like you have to engage with AGA as a transgender person. You don't have to engage with AGA as a gender diverse person, because we've created this space for you. So we've got a little poster there, which one of the important features of it is that it acknowledges how AGA dropped the ball for intersex people. It acknowledges what the intersex experience is. It tries to use neutral language to invite people to contemplate whether or not their own experiences are intersex experiences. And I think just by having something like that, where an intersex person can feel like that space has been created for them. Another really fantastic resource that, another resource that I feel like does some fantastic things is this intersex brochure that I've created, where rather than saying, you know, this is an intersex person and trying to create narrow things, I try to talk about what intersex experiences are. And so it talks about how, you know, you might have had to see a lot of doctors as a child. You might have surgical scars you can't explain. There might be a sense that, you know, parents can't really talk to you about something and you're not really sure why. And another great thing about this is that this is my opportunity where I use that sort of like, I talk about what's appropriate language, and it has a great thing because it educates allies on why you shouldn't use words like hermaphrodite and DSD. But to an intersex person reading this brochure, identifying with that language, it says you are intersex and you are welcome into this space. So I think there's a lot of interesting ideas in there where we need to talk about experiences rather than definitions. And we need to try and make sure that language creates sort of like, almost like little hooks where a person who might be approaching a space in a different way from what we anticipate will still feel welcome here. And I think that's something that AGA has done very well. Yeah, intersex support is needs-based and trauma-informed, and that ends up acting as a natural filter in LGBTIQ settings. So this comes back to what I was talking about before. If you create a space where medical conversation is heavily moderated, when you create a space that is more body positive, you're going to get, if you create something that intersex people need, that's going to make sure that it preserves the space for intersex people. Intersex people can either choose to engage with the space, and if a transgender person engages with the space, at least for us, there's opportunities to move them somewhere where they're going to be more comfortable. There'll be a feeling that this isn't necessarily my space, but there is going to be a space for them. So I think one of the important things is still like having these sort of referral networks that someone who approaches the space who doesn't necessarily have the right to the space can still have a space created for them. And I think there's a huge need to engage with lived experience. This comes back to this idea that there's 3 paid roles in Australia, and then what we have is a lot of LGBTIQ organisations that are doing things on our behalf without engaging with us, like running education that hasn't had intersex eyes put on it. It's sort of trying to say intersex people are welcome into groups, but not getting that sort of intuitive understanding of what intersex people need. that comes from having an intersex person run these things. It comes back to this idea of community engagement, where creating paid opportunities is super important when it comes to supporting intersex activism. Understanding that there's a lot of community organisations that struggle for resources, you got to have that engagement with the lived experience to make sure that the space can be safe for intersex people. And I think that that community engagement also has a knock-on effect that who you're seen with helps build confidence, and who you have connections with allows you to create a better resource. It's all about having confidence in your organisation and then having referral networks so that you can sort of live up to that confidence. So those are the things that I found have worked, and it's helped start to build a steady sort of intersex community here at AGA, which has been very, very encouraging. I know I'm on the right track because I have intersex people who feel safe in this space, who keep coming back, who get what they need from me. What can be done better? Sustainability. So here's where we sort of talk about some of the things that are a little bit more challenging, perhaps. When I say that we've built an intersex community here, the numbers aren't high enough that it's sustainable as compared to sort of the larger organisation. So we do run 2 intersex groups here at AGA. There's an intersex autonomous group, and then we have what we call side by side, which is the group for intersex adjacent people to get involved as well. And what I found is that there's a higher level of engagement with side by side because we've got a lot of parents who need to engage with AGA, and we have a lot of people who won't turn up the first time unless they have a partner with them. So side by side tends to be the more consistent group as opposed to the intersex autonomous group. But I think the visibility of having the intersex autonomous group is very, very important. If you don't create an opportunity for an intersex person to exist in their own space without necessarily being engaged with other ideas, then it's telling them that they're welcome. It's telling them that their experiences are valid. I also find that just because we don't necessarily get a lot of bums and seats from month to month, we do have very steady engagement with email-based support. A lot of people come to AGA with questions, and I try to answer them as best I can. So just having some sort of email support works well. Again, I think it comes back to this engagement with lived experience. The fact that someone who emails me knows that they're emailing an intersex person who's here to help them specifically is what helps encourage people to reach out in the first place, which is fantastic. It's one of the best parts of my job, honestly. There's a huge issue with integration with broader communities. So we have these 2 groups. This is kind of like, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. We have this idea of intersex at AGA where the brand is deliberately separated so that intersex people feel there's space created for them. But part of sort of like what makes that sustainable is if there can be integration with the broader group. And what we've found is there is absolutely no interest in attending any of the family groups, community groups, engaging with anything other than the intersex groups. Which makes sense. It makes a lot of sense. If you have people who are hostile to the idea of being thrown into TGD&I or LGBTIQ, you have people who don't identify as queer or part of the queer community. But I think that one of the things you have to be mindful of is that if you are trying to bring intersex people into the broader community, there's probably additional steps involved here, and I don't think you can create space for intersex people expecting them to then engage with larger groups. And I think that disconnect from the rest of the community makes it a little bit invisible. Like there's going to sort of like some of the transgender and gender diverse support groups, there's interest in who the intersex people are, People are obviously very aware that the intersex groups are going on, and there's sort of like an enthusiasm to sort of like bring them into the community and welcome them in. But I think that's sort of, you can't really manufacture that kind of engagement. What can be done better? Lack of services. So this is one of those things that I keep hitting my head up against again and again, is when I have someone ask for a trauma-informed, intersex-friendly GP and I don't have anyone I can refer them to. Yeah, it's obviously a big part of being able to be a support service is having resources and referrals and making sure that you can meet the needs of your community. But the reality is that when you're dealing with this idea that trans and gender diverse friendly resources are not necessarily intersex friendly resources, it limits what you can do for people. We do have a number of trans friendly GP services in the ACT that get along very well with our community that we're happy to make referrals to. But the reality of my position is that if I refer an intersex person to those spaces, it always comes with a proviso, but your mileage may vary. It might not be the right situation for you specifically. So that's one thing, is that if you're a referral service, you can't just assume that the same referrals will apply right across the board. The other thing is that training opportunities can create services. So another big part of AGA's sort of model is that we get out into the community, we get out into workplaces, and we provide education opportunities. To me, when I'm able to talk to a service provider, when I'm able to talk to a GP, when I'm able to talk to someone who can be someone for my community, what that is it's creating the symbiosis where the training becomes an opportunity to create intersex competent spaces. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities there. But again, if those education isn't tapping into that lived experience, you're not actually creating referral resources that are necessarily intersex competent. It always has to come back to this lived experience and that engagement with what intersex issues actually are. So that's a lot of very dense thoughts on how intersex peer support sort of works at AGA, what challenges we face, what we can do better. And I guess that rather than leave it on this note that all these things are somehow insurmountable, I think my work here at AGA actually makes me very, very optimistic as to what can be done for intersex people. To me, this is a model that can change lives for better. I think that having a paid intersex worker who can run support groups, who can be a point of referral, who can handle emails and all that kind of stuff, that's a really dynamic and exciting role that that does actually change intersex lives for better. I think that it's also a model that creates opportunities that matter, that if you're employing intersex people to do this kind of stuff, that you're changing that person's life and you're building these networks that really, really matter to the intersex community. The idea, again, I come back to this idea, there's very, very limited paid roles for intersex people in Australia, but there's dozens of intersex people who are sort of chomping at the bit to do this work for each other. The thing is that we can't just survive on volunteer hours. So creating the opportunities is really, really fantastic. And on that note, I feel like I'd like to thank the Canberra LGBTIQ Community Consortium for providing the funding for my position, and Agenda for creating this opportunity and just having patience as I explore what opportunities there are. It's been a learning experience for all of us. But I think that if I can leave you with just one note, is that I think this is a model that can work for LGBTIQ organisations to create opportunities and resources for intersex people. And that's really, really exciting to me. I understand why there's sort of this hostility and all these sorts of challenges that we face together. But to me, the opportunity to engage with LGBTIQ organizations is about having access to resources that we otherwise wouldn't have. And just the idea that, if just a fraction of these sorts of larger organizations are able to create these opportunities, we would have funded peer support right across Australia. Like, it could happen overnight. And it's things like that that just really, really excite me, and why I'm very, very pleased to be here today to offer some thoughts about this. That brings me to the end of sort of the webinar bit. I'm happy to take questions at this point.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cody. That was a phenomenal presentation. While you were speaking, there were a couple of little comments that come up, which I'll start with, and we'll invite people to write other questions in the chat box for Cody. So just reflecting back on a comment that Morgan Carpenter wrote, and they said, there are a lot of intersex people who are not old enough to have agency to determine their identity.
I didn't get heavily into the topic, but a lot of intersex issues are focused on childhood. Obviously, there's a huge pressure on parents to engage in medical intervention before a child can even express a gender identity. So it's an entirely valid point that often when you're dealing with an intersex person, you're in dealing with an intersex young person who can't necessarily make decisions for themselves yet. And what you have to do is create opportunities to preserve decision-making opportunities for that young individual.
Awesome, thank you. Tracy Clark also had asked about where they can get a brochure from AGA, but then Sel Cooper has responded that you can contact AGA through support account, support@genderrights.org.au.
We'll send you some, yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. And any information can be sent out to people by contacting the AGA website. Okay, question from Claire Allen. Uniting is looking to publicly sign the Darlington Statement in 2019. Can you suggest someone, an organisation we can approach who'd be able to come and talk specifically about the lived experience at this event, paid of course?
Where are they based?
Claire, where are you based? I'll just wait for Claire to respond and find out where they're based. All of New South Wales and ACT.
Feel free to get in contact with Agenda. We're Canberra based.
Awesome. Excellent, Claire. So yeah, shoot Cody and Agenda a message. A question from Olivia. Thanks, Cody. This is a big question, I know, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how LGBT and I funded services can work with LGBT, though no I, young people yet. Can we better meet the needs of intersex young people, including when educating school staff, service providers, etc.?
This gets back into sort of like one of my favorite topics of safe schools, and honestly, we don't create enough education opportunities for young people. To me, I have a couple of philosophies around this. Fundamentally, that you can't have discussions about intersex without hearing the word intersex. So like, to borrow from my own story here, I didn't find out I was intersex until I was 17, but I still went through this sort of process of dealing with a lot of doctors and knowing I was different and so on and so forth. I just never had the language to explore that. So a big part of it, when it comes to creating intersex resources for young people, is just giving intersex people language. Just like, as soon as you hear the word intersex, that's a question you can ask. And I think that's very, very important. The other sort of aspect to it is that when I say that intersex people deal with shame and isolation, there's no actual shame in being an intersex person. Being intersex doesn't make you more complicated, it doesn't make you more shameful, it's not a squishy, ugly conversation to have. when young girls and boys find learning about their bodies and how they're going to change over puberty and all this kind of human biology stuff, those children should be learning about intersex bodies as well. So I think that a lot of resources need to target that sort of human development, and I think that in doing so, that can also help break down some of the stigma as well. If your peer group also knows about intersex, it's not going to be as big of a deal to be intersex. And I think that's the sort of goal that we need to reach. I'm also working with Fifth Pact, Sexual Health and Family Planning here in the ACT, to hopefully develop some intersex educational resources. I don't know quite quite how that's going to necessarily fit into this idea of a national resource, but it might be something to keep an eye out for.
And I think the other part of that question there, Cody, was sort of about how LGBTI services only work within the LGBT remit, and I guess often might call themselves an LGBTI service, however, very rarely would actually focus on any intersex. And I'm sure that's something you see a lot.
As far as how that sort of manifests in youth spaces, the only sort of youth intersex organisation I'm really aware of is Interact, which is heavily American and media focused. It's just one of those areas where, again, the ball has been dropped. There's not really intersex youth services happening as of yet. It's something that needs resources put into it. So, it's a genuine issue, but I think in principle, if you're running an LGBT youth space, a lot of these things, a lot of the things I discussed today in terms of meaningful allyship and visibility and creating space for intersex people, being body positive and trauma informed, all of that can apply to a youth space as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Cody. Ruthie has asked, I work for Carers Victoria implementing the Rainbow Tick accreditation. One of our services is supporting support groups. Do you have any advice for setting something up based on your experience with Side by Side?
I think there have been a few challenges with the Rainbow Tick as a concept. Because I don't think it's largely seen as intersex competent, and it's not seen like, it seems like something that's sort of one and done and forgotten about. So I think that in terms of having intersex competency as part of the Rainbow Tick, there's some work that can be done there as far as sort of like basics are concerned. Definitely having signed off the Darlington Statement would be a big thing. I think like having created a space specifically for intersex people is a big thing. Potentially funding or creating paid opportunities for intersex people is a big thing there. So those are the sorts of things you should be looking at when it comes to sort of like ticking something off as intersex competent, I suppose. But actually, no, intersex, like engagement with intersex lived experience is probably the most key point. Now I think about it, because a lot of intersex peer support and a lot of intersex organisations are volunteer based. So, but ultimately, intersex people understand intersex needs best.
And Morgan Carpenter, who is from ERA, has actually made a comment that the Rainbow Tick is definitely not intersex competent. So that's obviously something to really keep in mind when doing Rainbow Tick, that there have to be additional tasks an organisation would have to do to ensure that they are intersex competent as well. Ricky has stated, Cody would love to connect with folk here in South Australia and wondered if you can suggest a contact here at all. I
believe AIS Support Group Australia does have a South Australian contact, so it's probably best to reach out to them.
And maybe that's a broader question, Cody, I guess, is when people in their local areas, how do they start establishing contact with the local intersex space? How do they find intersex people? How do they how do they reach out?
Yeah, okay, that was kind of a topic that I could have gone much more in depth into. So I think that there has to be engagement with the intersex community. So I think that when you have organisations like ERA and AI Support Group Australia, who do the fantastic work that they do and are so well established and so well respected, that the starting point is to have a relationship with organisations like that. I think then it's just sort of like comes back to basic fundamentals of advertising, is that if you're talking about 1.7% of the population, then every 100 sets of eyeballs on a poster, on a brochure, on anything, like you're getting to like one ping, like someone who might potentially then reach out to you. Another big initiative we had last year was tying into Intersex Day of Solidarity. We sent out brochure packs to all the GPs in Canberra, and some of that has been turning up. And I think that if you sit down and have a conversation with your doctor, and your doctor's able to hand you a brochure like this, that's going to put you ahead, and it's going to connect you to a community that's here for you. So I think, it's about connecting to what's established, and then just creating opportunities for intersex people to connect to you.
And it's great that you recommend about contacting, like going through ERA or AIS support group, because as you were reflecting earlier in your webinar, there's lots of different language groups will use, and not all groups will specifically use a word such as intersex. There might be a really broad range of language that different groups will use to describe themselves. So it might not be as easy as Googling intersex Adelaide and seeing what comes up.
Having, it's just occurred to me, having an online presence is really, really important, because, you find out you're intersex, the first thing you do is Google that. We do have our intersex Twitter account. We do advertise intersex services on our Facebook page. We do have intersex resources on our web page. So that kind of visibility is also really important. And I think as long as you're being visible and you're doing it right, people will come to you.
And it really sounds like, from what you were saying, the doing it right is really important. But that doing it right means being led by intersex people. That the structure, how services are designed, how they're developed, how they're implemented, is all led by intersex people themselves. It sounds like that's core. Awesome. Just wanted to, before we sort of tend to start to wrap up, just want to put another invitation out there for any other questions or comments for Cody before we finish up today. I've certainly really enjoyed our chat here today, Cody. It's been great to hear about the work that you're doing, and particularly in such a under-resourced space. Do you have your contact details, Cody, for people who wish to continue a conversation with you?
So my email is cody@genderrights.org.au. And if you want to call us, the office number is 02-6162-1924. I'm in the office typically Tuesdays to Fridays. My hours are a little bit variable depending on what groups I'm sort of working with.
Awesome. Lovely. Thank you very much. Any last minute questions? I'm sure, I know this is probably something Cody could speak about for many, many, many more hours, and there's lots of different tracks we can go down. But yeah, huge, so Olivia says, a huge thanks. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to you, Cody. I've been really enjoying, thanks for Sel. So Sel has just corrected the phone number. That's me, and my typing has just mistyped a number. Thank you, Sel, for doing that. yeah, thank you so much for Cody for sharing your wisdom and knowledge and expertise. And I'm really excited to see what more we're going to be seeing in the intersex space. And it's amazing to see such phenomenal peer-led services and support. That's really quite exciting. Just a reminder, everyone, today's webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the National LGBTI Health Alliance's website, probably within the next couple of days. And it's going to be a free access webinar that you can share throughout your networks. So really encourage people to sort of share this message wide and far, and to keep engaging this conversation about how do LGBT services better engage and better support the intersex part of our acronym that we often tag on to the end, but might not often actually deliberately think much about. So thank you so much, Cody, for bringing this really focused discussion. Really appreciate that.
No worries.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Lovely. Thank you, everybody. So we'll end the webinar now, and we'll see you all next month, and some promotion for our next webinar will be out shortly. So thank you, everyone, for participating today.